Jewish Channel's Week in Review. Racial unrest in Israel and religious disputes heat up too, commemorating a famous cartoonist's work, and more of the Jewish news that's changing your world right now in this episode of the Week in Review. Hello, and welcome to the Jewish Channel's Week in Review. I'm Stephen I. Weiss. Racial unrest continues to make headlines in Israel. A protest by so-called Ethiopian Jews in Israel saw hundreds gather in Tel Aviv this week, and 15 were arrested. The protest was against police brutality and specifically the decision not to prosecute the police officer caught on video beating a black Israeli soldier in April. And discrimination between Jewish denominations is also making news in the Jewish state. A new survey found majorities of Israelis seeking greater recognition of conservative and reform rabbis and movements, recognition that does not exist. 59% of Jewish Israelis want conservative and reform rabbis to have equal status to Orthodox rabbis, a move opposed by 90% of Orthodox Jews in the survey. But that search for equal status is sure to be more difficult under the new Israeli government, which has seated a religious affairs minister from an ultra-Orthodox party, where the last religious affairs minister, Naftali Bennett, was seen as a more moderating Orthodox voice. The new religious affairs minister, David Azalai, reportedly called the reform movement, quote, a disaster for the state of Israel. The quotes were reported in Haaretz as having come from a meeting with Israel's justice minister, Ayelet Shaked. Azalai also reportedly denounced the group Women of the Wall in the meeting with Shaked, who is a woman, saying, quote, the Western Wall belongs to everybody, but what these women do is provocation. To come with talitot, tefillin, and a Torah scroll is not praying, but rather provocation. And with the continued growth and impact of the ultra-Orthodox community in Israel, new income numbers from a large survey of the community show they are a group struggling much harder to get by than is the average Israeli household. More than 90% of ultra-Orthodox households in Israel have below average incomes. And that's before even taking into account the much larger average household size of ultra-Orthodox families. Less than half of ultra-Orthodox men have any kind of employment, even part-time or self-employment. That makes them more than 10 times as likely to be unemployed as the average Israeli. More than 3/4 of ultra-Orthodox women are employed, but that leaves their unemployment rate still about 5 times the average in Israel. While the numbers aren't specific enough to say precisely, it is clear that well more than 3/4 of the ultra-Orthodox in Israel would be considered impoverished by U.S. federal standards. Moving on, cartoonist Al Hirschfeld is the subject of a new exhibit, as Meredith Gansman reports in a segment for our theater show, Row J.
Known as the Lion King, artist Al Hirschfeld's work is on display in a new retrospective at the New York Historical Society. The Hirschfeld Century chronicles the life work of Al Hirschfeld, who drew everyone from celebrities such as Jerry Seinfeld and Whoopi Goldberg to politicians like Charles de Gaulle, and captured the entertainment industry on both the Broadway stage and the silver screen. It's the ultimate exhibit for guest curator David Leopold, who grew up on Hirschfeld's drawings. He remembers first looking for the Nina, an ode to Hirschfeld's daughter. He put her name in many of his drawings. Later in Hirschfeld's life, Leopold visited the artist often in his studio and cataloged his work.
So we don't look at them as documentary pieces, we look at them as artistic pieces. And that's really what, by looking at the show chronologically, you get the sense of development of his art.
Al Hirschfeld's third wife and widow and president of the Al Hirschfeld Foundation, Louise Kurz Hirschfeld, organized the exhibit, which shows the great arc of his creativity. Though Kurz Hirschfeld says that her late husband's greatest challenge was finding the soul of the person he was drawing, something she experienced personally.
When Al Hirschfeld drew me for the first time, we were sitting in a restaurant, and suddenly there were some crayons there and some paper for children to play with. And he picked up a crayon, and I saw him look into my eyes, and I said to myself, uh-oh, I think he's going to do something. I think he's going to do something. And he did, and I thought, this man has X-ray eyes. He is looking right through me, and I blushed, I got all red, and I started to get nervous because I said, what can he see inside of me that I haven't been revealing? Is there, I think he can find my deepest secrets.
For more from the Hirschfeld Century, tune into the full broadcast version of the Week in Review.
Thank you, Meredith. Finally, this week on Up Close, we all believe we can find a cultural tradition to explore and text to recognize as part of that tradition. But what are the ways that holes can get poked in that tradition, and how can a tradition be recovered or reclaimed? In the Jewish tradition, key texts have been changed, with items removed, added, or altered, and in the cases we know about, it's largely the ultra-Orthodox determining what stays and goes. University of Scranton professor Mark Shapiro reveals it all in Changing the Immutable: How Orthodox Judaism Rewrites Its History. And if there's any narrative most obviously missing from traditional Jewish texts, it's the stories of women's lives. Using short stories to fill in some gaps is American Jewish University professor Michal Lemberger in After Abel and Other Stories. Here's some of the highlights from my interview with Michal Lemberger. There's a long tradition of midrash, of taking the stories of the Bible, which are occasionally brief, occasionally surprisingly lacking in detail, occasionally confusing, and then expanding on those stories. And that seems unquestionably what you've done here.
I have an academic background, and my academic background is in what in the English world, the literature world, we call biblical literature and American literature. And I wrote a dissertation and I pulled those two together. So I'd been thinking about the confluence for a long time. And then I taught Bible as literature at UCLA, and then at American Jewish University, and each time I could go a little bit deeper into the scholarship, into the text, so it just percolated for a really long time.
You've got stories, so like Lot's wife, for example, who doesn't have a name in the Bible, you've given her the name
Puah.
But so how do you reimagine that story?
Well, it is kind of a spoiler to say that, here it is, she is the one who rains down the fire and brimstone. But I know for a fact that what drew me is the detail that gets ignored everywhere else, which is that in negotiating for his guests' safety, Lot offers his daughters to be gang raped. And that is shocking to a modern sensibility and unjust, and no one seems to care about that. Christian commentary, we all know what sodomy comes from there, although it doesn't happen in the story at all. And Jewish commentators talk about selfishness, right? That they didn't open their homes, they weren't gracious. But nothing about this offer. And so for me, who has two daughters, what mother would let that happen? Now, of course, there are mothers who would let that happen. That's another story altogether. But from my perspective, what mother would let that happen? And so she doesn't let it happen.
In general, with your stories, one of the things you say in your end note on all of these is that you've not tried to somehow impose modern values or to try to bring those or update the stories or bring them into the present. You've tried as much as possible. Like if they were struggling because of the circumstance of being a woman or being poor or of being in the middle of a desert, you wanted that struggle to remain a real part of the character.
Yeah, setting is important. A lot of people have updated these stories very successfully, taken the idea of Job and put a Job-like character into 21st century New York, for example. That's not a specific story that I'm referring to. But my expertise is not in that. What I have done is really immerse myself in the ancient world for 20 years, and so I feel like I know it in some ways. I know it imperfectly. I can't actually go back, but I can imagine it. I can imagine it as real. And it's a complicated world. We tend to think of biblical world as simple because we get a simple story, but it's just as complicated as our own world. And we may have to work a little harder to see that complication.
You can see the full episode of Up Close on the Jewish Channel on cable. You can also listen to the full audio of Up Close as a podcast available on iTunes or in your favorite podcast player. That's all for this week. From all of us here at the Jewish Channel, be well. The Jewish Channel is available on cable. Time Warner Cable Channel 1640, IOPLM Channel 505, RCN Channel 268, Cox Cable Channel 1, Bright House Channel 330, Verizon Fios Channel 900, and on Comcast on the on-demand menu on premium channels. For more information, visit tjctv.com.